Well, today's daf is daf Vav, and you may remember that Ram Gamliel made a proclamation that we can no longer rely on the kusim under any circumstances, and the Gemara is going to explain why in a minute, what changed, and we cannot rely on the shechita of a kusi. And the question was whether or not Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Zera accepted the interpretation of Rav Gamliel's edict. If it's possible that Rabbi Zera did not accept from Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, this is the Gemara, I'm just reviewing the Gemara that we did yesterday, is Lishne lekan Yisrael omer al gabav, kan b'she'ein Yisrael omer al gabav. He could have just simply given a very, very simple answer that it all depends whether or not these Yisrael is Omer al Gabav. El lav shma mino kiblu mine. We have to assume that Rabbi Zera accepted the interpretation of Rav Gamliel's Gzera from Rav Yaakov Bar Idi in this case, that even in a case of Yisrael Omer al Gavav, it wouldn't make any difference because the shechita of a kusi is considered like the shechita of a goyish mami. So now we start today's learning because until now we were just reviewing what we did yesterday. My time agozru behu rabbanan. Why was it that Rabbi Gamliel, and we'll soon see Rabbi Meir as well, decreed that we cannot rely at all on the shechita of the kusi? Ki had Reb Shimon ben Elazar shadrei Rabbi Meir. When Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar was sent to Rabbi Meir, lasuye cham Rabbi Bekusoi, to bring wine from the kusim, and now we get into the issue of maga b'yayin of a goy. Ashkechei ahu saba. Whenever it says ahu saba, the Mefarshim assume it's Eliyahu Hanavi. And he encountered Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar on his way to bring wine from the Kusim, and Eliyahu Hanavi Amalei, he said to him, quoting a pasuk in Mishlei, "V'samta sakin b'lo echa im bal nefeshata," which means don't eat what you might want to eat, but put like a knife somewhere in your jaw, so that you won't eat something that you shouldn't be eating, or in this case, drink something that you shouldn't be drinking. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar realized that this was a supernatural event. There was a message here that Eliyahu Hanavi was trying to convey. He doesn't understand exactly what the message is, so therefore he goes back to his Rebbe, Rabbi Meir, Halach Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar v'sipra dvarim lifnei Rabbi Meir, and he asked Rabbi Meir, "What's going on over here? The Eliyahu Hanavi is warning me not to drink from the wine of the kusim." When Rabbi Meir heard about this, Gazar Alehem, that's when he made the decree, which, as we saw until now, was the decree of Rabbi Gamliel. And my timer, why was he so eager to prohibit the wine from the kusim? Or Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Demus Yona Motzel Lehem Barosh Har Grizim. Right, the kusim were living at Har Grizim, and it came to pass that the witnesses testified that there was an image of a dove on the top of the har, and they were Shayu Ovdano, so they would worship it, they would bow down to it. So the kusim now became idol worshippers. And what that means is that they use their wine as part of the libations to worship their idol, in this case, the dove at the top of the Mount Gerizim. And even though it was only a small percentage of the kusim, it wasn't like en masse all the kusim worshipped this dove. But Rabbi Meir l'taimei d'chayish l'miyuta, wherever you find a question of miyut, of worrying and concerned about a minority, then Rabbi Meir always is consistent and he is choshesh for the miyut. And gazaruba atu miyuta. Therefore, he instituted this decree to prohibit the wine of the kusim because the majority now has to be treated like the minority. So, on account of the minority of those kusim that worship the idol, he decreed that even the majority, the balance of the kusim, are considered like idol worshippers, and we cannot drink from their wine. And Rav Gamliel based Dino Nami Rabbi Meir Sviruli, that which we said before about Rav Gamliel, that the kusim are treated like goyim, that is in accordance with Rabbi Meir. So they both apparently came up with the same concern for the fact that the kusim were worshipping idols, and therefore they prohibited their shechita. Now, if you recall, when Eliyahu encountered Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, he quoted a pasuk in Mishlei, and the Gemara now wants to analyze that pasuk. And by way of introduction, we'll make the following comment that all of Mishlei, which mean parables, are to be interpreted not literally, but as parables. Now, this old man, which we said we identified him as Eliyahu, he looked at this verse, and he interpreted it as referring, because the pasuk says Baal Nefesh, to a person of high moral standards. And the pasuk is going to tell us that you should refrain from consuming food that might be forbidden because you're a Baal Nefesh, you're on a high standards. And the wine of the kusim might come from the minority who are worshiping and pouring libations for their holy dove. So the Gemara asks Pashi the Krab and Mike Siv, what is this parable in the pasuk? V'talmud Yoshev lifnei Rabo. It's a reference. So remember, the pasuk said that you should put the knife in your jaws, which means refrain from opening your mouth. Under what circumstances should a Talmud refrain from opening his mouth? Meaning, the Talmud is having trouble with understanding the Rebbe. He has a question and a contradiction to what his Rebbe said. And as a general rule, we encourage Talmidim to ask as many questions as they can. But there's going to be one exception, which is written, or shall we say, alluded to in this pasuk. To Tani Rabbi Chia, Kisei Shev Lilchom. This is the very next pasuk. Kisei Shev Lilchom es Moshe. The word Lilchom has a reference to lechem, and lechem is a symbol of Torah. And if you're sitting to eat bread, meaning to absorb the Torah of Moshe, of your ruler, who is the Rebbe, bin tavin es ashel lefanecha. You should analyze the situation in front of you. Before you start asking questions, decide whether it's A or B. And if you have reason to believe that, as we'll explain immediately, that it's not a good idea to ask your questions, then samta sakin bloecha in bal nefeshata. Then if you're sensitive as a soul and you don't want to insult somebody, then put this knife in your jaw, meaning close your mouth, and here's what you have to analyze. If he knows that his Rebbe is such an expert that no matter what question the Talmud has in his mind that he'll raise, the Rebbe will find an answer to it, then bin. Bin means bina, miloshem bina, to analyze the shear of the Rebbe, ask your questions, and if you have any doubts, the Rebbe will clarify your doubts. But in Lav, if you have reason to suspect that your Rebbe is not on that great level that he could answer all your questions, resolve all contradictions, Tavines Ashelafanecha, understand the situation that you find yourself in, and then Samta bin Blech, you should put a knife and don't ask the question. And the reason for this is that if you'll ask your question, knowing full well that the Rebbe is not capable of answering it, then you'll embarrass the Rebbe. So rather than humiliate the Rebbe, don't ask your questions. And even more than that, in Bal Nefesh Ata Proshe Menu. If you see that you're at the level of an advanced student, so that you have many, many questions to ask, and the Rebbe is not capable of answering them, then Proshe Menu, meaning find yourself another Rebbe. Back to the Kusim. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Yosef Shadre Rabbi Avo Lasuye Chamra Mibei Kusoi. So Rabbi Yitzchak was a shliach of Rabbi Avo to bring wine from the Kusim. Ashkrehu Saba, once again, the same story. He encounters this old man, which we identify as Elyonav. The Amalei said, and this old man says to him, Leskan Shomrei Torah. Don't buy wine in this locale because there's no one here in this locale that observes the Torah. This is the locale of the Kusim, and they're not careful about the Torah. And again, as we saw before, the shliach is very perplexed by the words of this elderly gentleman. He goes back to the Mishaleh. Holach Rabbi Yitzchak v'siper dvarim l'fnei Rabbi Avo. He went back to Rabbi Avo, and he tells him the story. And now Rabbi Avo himself thinks that there's some deeper meaning to what's going on over here, meaning why did Eliyahu Hanavi warn us not to drink the wine of the Kusim? And Sipur Dvarav L'fnei Rabbi Ami v'Rav Asi. So Rabbi Avo went and presented this entire story to Rav Ami v'Rav Asi. Lo zozu misham ad shaso'um ovdei kochavim gemurim. At that point, the Amoraim, Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi, decided that, what Eliyahu Hanavi is trying to convey to us is that the Kusim are considered like idolaters. And I find this a little strange because we said that that's only according to Rabbi Meir, who's Chayshina Lemiuta, but apparently it got to the point, it was really out of hand, and most of the Kusim were worshipping idols. Therefore, they decreed that the Kusim henceforth be considered like Ovdei Avodah Zarah in all respects. Lamai. One second. Why would I need in a later generation Rav Ami and Rav Asi to come to the conclusion that we have to consider the Kusim as Ovdei Kochavim? Already in earlier generations, during the time of the Tanoim, they had already, whether it's Rav Meir or Rav Gamliel, they had already prohibited and invalidated the shchita and the yayin of the Kusim. So why do I need Rav Ami and Rav Asi, Lo Zozu Misham? They didn't budge from the place until they declared that the Kusim are considered like idol worshippers. So the Gemara says, okay, just a little short introduction to this Gemara's answer. The Gemara says the following. We have a principle I'm going to call it, because I studied a little bit of constitutional law in America, we have something called the system of checks and balances, if you remember that. And in halacha, we have also, with regard to Gzeres D'Rabbana, we have a system of checks and balances. If the tzibur doesn't accept the gzera, like for example, the Gemara at the end of Avodah Zarah speaks about shemen akum, that they prohibited initially purchasing oil from goyim in order to separate the Jews from the goyim, but it didn't remain. We do buy oil from the goyim because einat tzibur yichol lamod bo. So here also, there were two stages in the process. Stage one is inu gozav lo kiblu minei, even though Rabbi Meir both and Rabbi Gamliel came up with this Gezerah decree to classify and define the Kusim as Ovdei Avodah Zarah, they didn't accept it. The people didn't accept it. They were too connected with the Kusim. But Osu, Rabbi Ami, Rav Asi, once it got to the point where this was going haywire with the Kusim, and Rav Ami and Rav Asi stepped up to the plate and said, we have to decree that they are idol worshippers, Gazru v'kiblu minai, they accepted. Now, if you take a look at the words of Rav Ami and Rav Asi, it says, Sha'asom ovdei kochavim gmurim. What's the extra word gmurim? Complete, total. My ovdei kochavim gmurim. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Okay, now here we need a long introduction. I'm going to try to make it short. It's what we call Eruvei Chatzeros. So we have something called a chatzer, which means that there are many apartments of different owners that converge onto one courtyard, and through the courtyard they go out to the public domain. Now, according to Torah law, you're allowed to carry from your apartment out into the courtyard. Not out to the public domain, but into the courtyard you can. The courtyard does not have the status of Rishus HaRabim because it's sort of like enclosed. It's like a circle of apartments around the center courtyard. So the Rabbanan said that since there's a joint ownership over this chatzah, we're going to consider it midrabanan as a Rishus HaRabim, unless you make an Eruv Chatzeros. Now, to make an Eruv Chatzeros, what you need is that everyone agree that there's like one ownership over the Chatzer. And each person who owns an apartment that surrounds and feeds into this Chatzer will now be makneh. He will transfer ownership over his private property for the benefit of the entire mini community, as I call it. But it doesn't require a kinyan. Even though technically, if I want to transfer ownership over my apartment to you, we require a deed, a shtar, or maybe a different type of kinyan. But here, the Rabbanan did away with the requirement of the kinyan. It's only if I could, again, I might be getting into deep trouble when I say it's like a quasi kinyan. It's not a real kinyan. It's a kinyan just for the purpose of what's called shitufe muvos, of creating this chatzah, this Eruv. Now, once the Eruv is created, then we don't see it as this is the Rishus of Ruvain, of Shimon, and Levi, but rather it's one entity. However, the problem is going to be if there's a guy living in the Chatzir, living in one of the apartments that feed into the Chatzir. And Chazal said that that guy cannot be makneh and transfer ownership over his apartment to allow us to carry from our apartments into this Chatzir. In other words, the Eruv is completely gone as a result of one guy. And that makes it very uncomfortable for the people on Shabbos because they can't, you can imagine today you have the baby carriages, all this kind of stuff. They want to come out, and be there. So even though a guy, an akum, is not allowed to join in the Eruv, however, they made a dispensation, and they said that what he could do is, instead of being makna in this quasi-fictitious kinyan, his apartment, his dira, to the entire community, so to speak, he could remove himself from his apartment. He gives up his rights, his ownership rights to the apartment, as if he were giving a gift to the Jewish people in that I call it a chatzir. But again, this is a whole to do in Masech Eruvin, but the Rabbanan did not want to rely on the guy to remove himself and secede ownership. Instead, they wanted an effective kind of a kinyan called schirus. So in effect, we have three different levels. We have one level of this fictitious hakna, which is okay if all the neighbors in that sharing that chotzer are Jewish. Then we have another level which could have been effective, in which the guy, instead of being makne in a kumvase, he just removes himself from the ownership, and that's called siluk. And now we have a third category, which is called schirus, in which case he could rent his house to the Yisraelim, and then they make the chutz. They make the eruv. Now, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak made a statement that as a result of the decree of Rav Ami and Rav Asi, they decreed that the kusim are like ovdei kachavim legmurim. What is that extra word gmurim? And the word gmurim means they cannot join the eruv. So if you have, let's say, 9 Jewish families sharing a common chutzner and one kusi who's part of that chutzner, he cannot do siluk, he cannot relinquish his rights to the chutzner to allow the Jewish people to carry from their homes into the chutzner, but he has to rather do schirus. Why? Because he's considered like a god. So let's just read it inside. Omer Rab Nachman Bar Yitzchak levatel rishus v'litein lechus kedesanya Yisrael mumer mishamer Shabbato b'shuk. If a Shabbos violator is careful in public to avoid chil Shabbos, then mevatel rishus v'nosen rishus. Then we're going to allow him to do siluk, because he's not yet on the level of a full-fledged guy. But she'eno meshaber Shabbato b'shuk, meaning even if not even, in event that he violates the Shabbos publicly, then eno mevatel rishus v'nosen rishus. Yisrael nosen rishus u'vatel rishus. Only a full-fledged Jew has the rights to facilitate the eruv by relinquishing his chelik in the apartment in that deal. But over Yiskar, with regard to a guy, he has to go through a rental agreement in which he rents out his apartment to the Jewish people, and that's what could create an eruv. And the same thing now will apply to the kusim who are considered ovdei kachavim gmurim. Ketzad amalo, if it's a Jew, reshusi kri lecha, reshusi vutelis lecha. Even though there was no actual Maisa Kinyan, that could create the eruv, and all he has to declare is either I'm transferring my ownership rights over to you, or I'm relinquishing siluk, my rights. And the Kinyan is a fictitious but reliable Kinyan to allow for the eruv. But we don't need a formal Maisa Kinyan. But in the case of an Oved Kochavim, it's not enough that he simply makes this declaration, I'm ceding my rights or relinquishing my rights. He's got to enter into a rental agreement in which he rents out his apartment to his Jewish neighbors. And Rav Asi and Rav Ami said that the Kusim are considered like idolaters. Another story. Rav Zera of Rav Asi iklu lefundaka de Yoy. Yoy is a place where they lodged. And Aisu Kamayu Beitzim Hamitzumakos Biyayin. Now, we have to point out here, very important, that we have a halacha of an Amma Oretz. An Amma Oretz is choshed on a maisrus, that he wasn't mafresh masa. Now, if the Amma Oretz has grains and even vegetables, mirabanon, and he wasn't mafresh masa, that's tevel. and you're not allowed to eat it. Now, beitzim are not subject to the law of maser, but yayin is subject to the law of maser. And now he mixed the eggs with the wine. The wine ingredient is tevel, because we're talking about ignorant people. So Reb Zera lo achal. Reb Zera would not eat at this lodge in Yai because the Amoritz was serving him tevel, or so he suspected. Rav Asi ochal, Rav Asi ate it. Amalei Reb Zera Rav Asi v'lo chayish mar l'tarovas mai. I mean, after all, this Amoritz was not mafresh maser, and now the wine is dmai. Dmai means we're not sure if he was mafresh or not, and the dmai is now mixed in together with the eggs. Lavadaita, you're right. I should have thought about it. I didn't think about it. Reb Zera was not happy with this situation. Omar Reb Zera, efsha gozru al tarovas dmai umistayem bilsad Rav Asi lemechal isura. Could it be that the Eibushter set it up in such a way that Rav Asi would violate an Isa Dmai? No. That's impossible, because Hashta behem teshel tzaddikim and HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevi takol al yodam tzaddikim atzma lo kolshkein. Right, we're going to learn about the chamor of Pinchas ben Yair, that he would refuse to eat Dmai. The mule, he didn't eat Dmai. And how much more so a tzaddik would not eat Dmai. Is therefore the only way, says Rabbi Zera, that I could retroactively explain and justify how Rav Asi drank the wine here, meaning ate this mixture of wine and eggs, is only if I assume that Dmai is only prohibited in a case of be'en. Be'en meaning where you eat the Dmai, pure Dmai, unadulterated. But in this case, where the wine was mixed with the eggs, Nofak Rabbi Zera Dok v'Ashkach Desanya Lokech Yayin Loses Litoch Hamorios or Litoch Halutios Karshinin Lasos Behem Tchinin or Adoshin Lasos Behem Resisin Chayev Mishumai V'Ein Tzorch Lomar Mishum Tmai V'Hein Atzmon Mutarim Mipnei Shein Taroves. And basically, what's going on over here is that Rabbi Zera went out and checked, and he found a brisa, and the brisa says that tarovis of Dmai is not us. So therefore, if you buy from the Amoritz the original, let's say, for example, you buy you buy the wine, and now you're going to mix the wine with whatever, fish, or with a beverage that's made of wine and oil and whatever, a whole different thing. That's awesome. For example, you want to buy from him vetch to make from it ground vetch, or lentils to make ground lentils. That you're not allowed to do. Even though, again, it's going to be a kind of tarovis, but nevertheless, you're creating the tarovis. You're not allowed to take Dmai and deliberately mix it. But if he buys from the Amoritz after the whole process was done already, right? The fish brine was mixed already, the aluntis or the ground kvetch was already grounded, the lentils were already ground, and so forth and so on, then mutarim why neshev tarovas. So anyway, you see from this brisa that when the Rabbanan prohibited Dmai, because they were afraid that maybe the Amoritz is feeding them tevel, and he wasn't mafresh maser, they only prohibited the be'en, the original, but not after it's mixed together. Frekti Gemara, is this really so? V'lo gazer al tarovas Dmai v'atan, you're going to prove from a brisa that there was a gzera that prohibited taroves, a mixture of Dmai, hanose l'shchemto iso lefos ukeder levashel. Right, a person gives his neighbor a dough and says to the neighbor, you know what, you bake the dough. Or he gives his neighbor a pot to cook in. and he provides everything. All the food products were his, meaning he's the chaver, he's the reliable. And now the question is, giving the dough to the neighbor, the neighbor who's an Amoritz might add spices. You don't have to worry about the spices that they add. Lo mishum shvius v'lo mishum maser, even though, let's say, there is an obligation to be mafresh maser from sior and from tavlin. Right, sior, we said, I think we learned this, is a kind of leavening agent. And we're not concerned that your neighbor will take his or her ingredients and add them to the mixture. So you provided all the ingredients, all the raw materials, and you don't have to worry that far. You don't have to go. V'im amar la asili mishalichi. But if you say to your neighbor, you know what, you use your own ingredients, then choshish l'sar v'tavl shabbat. Then you have to worry that maybe the ingredients that your neighbor who's an Amoritz is adding to this thing is tevel or shvius. In any event, you see clearly from this brisa that even tarovis is also, because the brisa is saying that if you give permission to the Amoritz neighbor to add the ingredients, then you can't eat it, even though these ingredients are a tarovis. Shani Hasan that came with the Lichi Mishalechi Kimandi or Biadaimdom. Since you told your neighbor, go ahead and use your own ingredients and mix them in, it's as if you mix them deliberately. We said that actively you're not allowed to mix it. But Rafram gives another answer. Shani Sarvatavlin till the time avidi the time alobot. When with regard to tarovis, we have rules and laws and restrictions that limit the din of bittul in a tarovis. So one of them is that a dover also the timer, something that's going to impact on this mixture and give it a tam, that's not but. And here, since we're talking about ingredients like leavening agents or different condiments like spices and stuff like that, that's a davar milsa divil tam, and it's also. Now, I had a long discussion here, prepared for this year, about the nature of Dmai. And that is whether Dmai is a Heftzeh Disura or it's just an Isa Gavra, because the Gemara is going to tell us that Aniyim are allowed to eat Dmai. So I thought the Nafkamina might be Tarovis, because if it's only an Isa Gavra, so maybe they only prohibited when you eat straight away Dmai, but not if it's mixed. Whereas if it's a Heftzeh Disura, then you have to know the laws of Bittul. But here it seems from the Gemara that you really have to apply the principles of Bittul and go through the laws of Tarovis in order to be Matir Dmai in a mixture. And in an event that it's Avida L'Taima, there's no Bittul, and you're not allowed to eat a mixture of Dmai, which would seem to indicate that Dmai is a Heftzeh Disura, not like I said. Anyway, now the Gemara asks the following. Right? If you gave your ingredients, you're the Talmud Chacham, you're the Chaver, to the Amoritz, then you can rely on the fact that there's no problem of Dmai, that Meiser was taken off. You took off Meiser. And now the Gemara is asking, but maybe your Amoritz neighbor is going to change. He's, might see that, the ingredients that you used are not the best, and he'll substitute his or her ingredients and their Dmai. Vatanan, and in fact, we learned in the Mishnah in Masechta Dmai that Hanosein lechamoso, a man gives a dough to his mother-in-law, and his father-in-law is an Amoritz, Ma'aser eshu no say law the eshu no tell me men. Now, the fact that he has to be maser everything that he gave her is very simple because he doesn't want to be machshil her. She's not going to be mafresh maser in teva. But then it says veshu notel mimena, that which he takes back is he has to be mafresh maser. Why? And the answer is she wants to serve her son-in-law some very good bread, and she'll see that the bread that he gave her and all the dough and everything else is beginning to get spoiled, to be right spoiled. So she wants to give him fresh bread. So she's going to now substitute her own ingredients, whatever it is for the dough and so forth and so on, and that's tamai. Anyway, we see clearly that you have to worry about the fact that even though you gave the ingredients to the Amoritz might switch them. And therefore, right, the brisa that says that when you're asking the Amoritz to prepare for you the dough and bake the dough, it all depends whether you're giving him the ingredients or he's providing the ingredients. So now the Gemara is saying, well, even if you gave him the ingredients, you have to worry about the fact that maybe he saw that this was not going well and he's going to substitute his ingredients. And the Gemara says, no, Hasam, Kiktani Taima is a special reason over there in the Mishnah D'mai, because Omer Rabbi Yehuda Rotze hi b'takonas pita ubusha michasanasa. Normally, we don't have any reason to suspect that the Amoritz is going to switch the ingredients and put in tevel instead of what you gave the Amoritz and provided him with. But in the case of a mother-in-law who's preparing bread and baking the bread for her son-in-law, here she has vested interest to make sure that her daughter will not be insulted, or what's the word the Gemara uses? She's worried about the well-being of her daughter, that the bread that's being offered here to her son-in-law is very fresh, and she's worried about the embarrassment of her son-in-law when he says, whoa, this is spoiled bread. So there's reason to believe and suspect that she exchanged her ingredients for his. But that's a special case. But li'alma lo chayshina, meaning in general, we have no reason to suspect that the Amoritz is going to switch the ingredients. That far we don't have to go.